Welcome to the webinar with Banny Banerjee. So we're at the Innovation Center Denmark studio here in Palo Alto in Silicon Valley. My name is Søren. I'm the director of the Innovation Center Denmark, and I'm really very happy and proud to be joined by Banny Banerjee from Stanford University, d.School and Change Labs in our studio here for a talk on design thinking and how to apply this as a core mindset when developing new FinTech solutions. Banny, you are, amongst many other things, the director of Change Labs at Stanford University. You work with, and you have been working with, design thinking and strategic initiatives and large-scale transformations for a number of years. You're also advising a very high number of global players, including World Economic Forum. You work with and you advise also the Danish Design Council. And you're actually a very well-known figure in Denmark. I realized just how well-known in the very many positive reactions that we had when we announced that you would join us for this seminar. But why don't you just say a few words about yourself and your work?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I have a special interest in Denmark. It's one of my favorite places, not because the place is so beautiful, but because I have had many occasions to speak about innovation with and work with people in Denmark. So I have a special relationship there. So very glad to be here. A little bit about myself. I am a designer, and I used to be an architect and a product designer and also an engineer. But over time, I started working in the design field, and while I was there, my journey took me to ways in which design could be used for more strategic purposes, and a new kind of approach to design of things that are much broader than products came about, and I was very much a part of that small community forming it, and we can talk a little bit about that today.
We'll focus our talks here on on three items to take us through innovation and the financial sector. First of all, the sort of nature of design thinking, setting the scene for innovating the financial sector, innovation in the sector, and what is design thinking and why should you care? I think we agree that you should. And then design thinking and FinTech innovation, how to actually employ design thinking in relation to FinTech and in the development of your innovation strategies, and then a little bit more concrete, how do you actually get started and how do you work concretely with the design thinking? What is design thinking and why is it relevant for the financial sector?
So you mentioned two words, innovation and design thinking. Perhaps I can start with the word innovation. So innovation is used in many ways, the words, and it's much overused. And people don't make a distinction between innovation and innovations, and often innovation is used synonymously with anything that's new, or technology, or IT systems, or what have you. But at Stanford and in Silicon Valley, we take a very different view of innovation. So I have a very simple definition for innovation. It is whatever it takes to outperform the normative, which is outperform business as usual by a very large margin, in order to create completely new possibilities, new experiences, new paradigms, and in a sense, new trajectories going into the future. So anything that changes what business as usual is capable of doing by a very large margin is innovation. Now, you also mentioned design thinking, and I think a lot of people might have heard about this term, and it's becoming almost like a commonplace, and you can have dinner table conversations in families in Denmark around design thinking. So I don't know how much of this is new, but I will actually give you a little bit of a history of design thinking so that you kind of get what this is about. So back in, I would say, 98 or so, at that time, the design field was very active, just like it had been before, but it was very fragmented. So, and it still is at some level. So you have product design architects, furniture designers, car designers, movie makers. All of these people are creative designers, but they work in their own niche and they don't necessarily work with each other and so on. And for a number of reasons that I won't go into now, around 2000, when there was actually an economic crash taking place in the US, the industry changed, and what transpired was the recognition that the ways in which designers work, which is the tools that they use, the way they use the same brain that everybody's given, is particularly well suited for a class of challenges that are a little less defined. They are ill-defined. They involve issues that are not well served by normative processes, such as understanding human aspects, and also how do you break through and think outside the box in any situation. So it needn't be a product, it needn't be a service, but given any situation, how do you bring a lot of creativity to bear, but also can you break away from the normal linear ways of working on it and bring some of the tools that designers use to solve very difficult problems elegantly, but can you bring that thinking? So early on, it used to be a culture of designers who used a lot of their own skills, like kind of innate skills, and also developed skills, but in intuitive ways. But what came about is the formulation of that into a process that can be easily learned, can be easily taught, can be easily followed, and also can be easily incorporated into an organizational culture. And this got picked up by the business community because they realized that there was it crossed many gaps. And so there's a process there, there's a mindset there, there's an approach there, but it is remarkably different from the normal business processes, and it is of great value in many different ways.
Why is it particularly relevant for the financial sector then?
Yeah.
What is it that's happening in the financial sector, and how is design thinking relevant there?
Yeah. I think that we are in the midst of profound changes and also very rapid changes. And the entire world is changing in very interesting ways. And the kind of thinking that we use in normal businesses, particularly legacy businesses, had emerged at times that was a very different world order from where we find ourselves. And FinTech is actually in that larger world is seeing an even bigger revolution, because the brick and mortar organizations that had come to mean the financial sector is undergoing a massive upheaval from both sides. From one side, in terms of a completely different ecosystem of possibilities, which technology and other changes out there are making possible, but also disruption because the business landscape is changing, customer behavior is changing, expectations are changing, and the sensibilities are changing. And so in a sense, the ground that was very firm is cracking, as at the same time as which enormous possibilities are opening themselves. And that creates a need for innovation, because business as usual is not only not advisable, is not even an option. There's no discussion anymore that you need to think differently and bring a lot of innovation, because you simply do not have the time to catch up with standard model thinking. You actually have to be innovative, and your organization needs to be innovative, and your leadership models need to incorporate innovation. But the other thing is that what we are finding is that in typical industries, you created the boundary conditions around the processes of your industry, and out there were some users and some other stakeholders and so on, and you essentially created your product or services, and you had to just provide it, and if it was of value, the customers would come to you. That entire equation has changed. You are now working much deeper into the lives of the people, and they are expecting a level of sensitivity and seamlessness, and they are very quick to change, and the change can be very rapid, where an entire industry can have the rug pulled from under them, no matter how established they are and no matter how many clients they have. And so unless you understand the more complex world of human behavior and their unmet needs and their motivations and the larger changes that are happening, and you build sophisticated ways of bringing that into your business processes and your decision making and your strategic initiatives, you're actually being taking on a massive risk of being outmoded and being disrupted by people who are not even going to come from your own industry. They're going to come from elsewhere.
And why is it design thinking can then particularly assist and help your process?
Because design thinking is particularly well suited for things that are ill-defined, where where there are foggy projects or foggy situations with great uncertainty, partial information, things changing really quickly, with a massive human factor, where you're not deterministic thinking and very logical thinking that and silver bullet things that we now understand the problem, we are going to solve for that kind of way, just is not appropriate. And design thinking does beautifully out here, and it does beautifully out here because it can conceive of possibilities that hasn't been done before, but with a great deal of sensitivity to the human factor, but ways of working that have a way in which to eradicate and identify failure modes very inexpensively to create very integrated and robust solutions in rapid time frames. So that's what design thinking is promises and delivers, and it also allows you to match your clock tick with the clock tick of change out there.
And what is then because when you employ design thinking, you go down that avenue, what are your sort of iterations? I mean, where do you want to position yourself in relation to the process? How do you actually proceed on such a thinking?
So perhaps instead of talking about the attributes, I should explain what some of the process steps are. And in a sense, it's not magical in and of itself. It's just that people don't do it, right? So it's not difficult to do, but culturally, given how we normally make decisions, it seems to be something that without a lot of leadership and without a lot of organizational change and a push towards organizational change, it's hard to incorporate that automatically. So what it entails first and foremost is, instead of having an inbuilt theory that you just deliver on, or have a technology that you see the solution in terms of, that way of thinking to a design thinker is like a hammer. Is always going to find everything that looks like a nail, right? To a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you come in technology first, or your business model first, then you see the world in terms of that, and you don't actually don't perceive what the world really needs. So first and foremost, the design thinking methodology creates a space where you become somewhat naive and don't push your ideas, and go in and really understand what is happening in the minds and the hearts of users and other stakeholders, not just the end user, but the stakeholders who control your fate, right? Anyone who can aid or impede your cause, right? That's the definition of the customer. And you don't just go and ask them questions, because they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know really what they need. Your job is to figure out what they cannot even articulate, but once you have figured out what it is that they need better than they can articulate themselves, then when you come up with something, they'll say they've always needed that, right? Because we didn't wake up one day saying I need an iPhone, right? But once something like that was put in our hands, it becomes an extension of you. So the designer's job is to understand the part of the iceberg which is under the water. The top of the iceberg is what people will say, but your job is to understand what lies under. And that's step one, because without doing that, you're working with your own theories, right? And pre-existing theories with your your theories of success that are very weak because they came out from your mind rather than from understanding the user's mind, which is actually much more complex than any designer or any engineer can conceive of. Then what you do is you raise it up in levels of abstraction, and you move away from the very practical real level to frame it in more abstract terms and with a lot of synthesis. Now, synthesis is different from analysis. Analysis is breaking down a problem and into looking at components in very careful ways and gaining your confidence there. Synthesis is adding things together and asking what is going through all this, or the information we are finding. And then, having done the synthesis and having done a frame, on top of the frame you start laying strategic initiatives in terms of something that the frame is telling you, which is a very important way of understanding the situation. And based on that, you go divergent again, and you generate many ideas, not one, but a multitude of ideas. And then you go convergent, and this process looks like an accordion. It goes divergent and convergent and divergent and convergent. And so you go divergent, create many ideas, and when you converge, you don't just put something out in the market. You prototype them in very rough and crude methods, but use them not as a solution, but as a question to understand what is going on in the minds of the people. Now your solution is not a solution, it's a probe to understand what are the forces that are going to collide based on this. Is a very elegant way of understanding what the problem really is. And then you iterate and say, okay, we didn't really understand the problem correctly. We need to modify our strategy and go very iteratively, and you're essentially rolling things out, and you're not calling it a product, and you're essentially baking in all the understanding the failure modes, small ones and big ones, because even small ones can take you down, and creating robust solutions as early as possible, but also understanding what innovating on the business model, innovating on the value chain, innovating on the ways in which the stakeholders will engage, but ultimately being very focused on the richness of the experience you're creating, because the customer out there do not care about the technology. They just want to get the value that they want in the moment that they want it, right? So that's kind of the process. So if you had to get this process into an organization, you need people to value this. You need to have people who value the understanding of the customer, their mindsets, their predicaments, their constraints in the situations. They need to value framing at abstract levels. They need to be able to create and generate many solutions that are out of the box. They need to de-risk it by other means such as prototyping, and this needs to become a part of the culture, so that the way you evaluate and the way you run your projects have this process as opposed to some of the more normative processes.
And this opens up sort of a range of questions. I think one avenue I think that could be interesting to start with here is leadership models in relation to this. Can you talk a little bit about leadership models and roles in relation to?
Yes, I think that leadership has become leadership models, and knowing which type of leader you are has become more important than ever, particularly because we find that in terms of the era we are moving into, our organizational structures and our cultures are not in sync, right? We are not aligned with the way the future is. We are moving into a very uncertain and turbulent time with very much shorter clock ticks of change than our organizational processes are geared for. And so leadership is very important in so many different ways, in changing one's organizations, changing the culture, the way projects are structured, the way teams are run, what is valued, what is not, how the processes that involve much more co-creation and co-creating the solutions with people, etc. And leadership becomes very important. And leadership is also, the models are changing from being a very hierarchical system, which came from, if you think about a typical leadership models, they came from the nation state and the military, etc., and got further reinforced in the Industrial Revolution, where executive thinking was centralized and the decentralized components of the organization were not allowed to do executive thinking. And now we are seeing models where you want innovation in the ecosystem, where everybody, irrespective of rank, is actually trying to contribute to the innovation capacity of the system. So the part of the leader, first of all, becomes how do you create that ecosystem, and how to create that enabling ecosystem that goes beyond the walls of your organization, because you're now having a very porous boundary between your organization and the outside. And part of it is an internal change, because this is not just a change in skills, it's a change in mindset and a value system, and I'll say a philosophical stance. So there is a certain amount of work that to be done in internal reframing, and the internal word is almost like a fractal. It is the person, it's the team, it's a division, it's the organization, it's the board, it's the industry, it's the entire larger ecosystem. There's an internal and an external part, and that is changing. And I would say that innovation capacity has become one of the crucial vectors or dimensions of leadership capacity now. It's operational excellence is taken for granted. It's something that was made a big deal about when you did not have the tools for operational excellence. Now it's like it's the table stakes. The game has shifted to whether you can be innovative or not. And if you're a small agile startup, then you have to be very innovative in order to land with the right trajectory with minimal means and make your small resources make a big splash. And if you're a big organization and you're being threatened by people who are much more agile than you, who don't really need to understand your industry to completely disrupt you, then how do you bring in innovation capacity there? But I would say that there's another thing that's emerging, which is we talked about design thinking, and design thinking can be framed very, I would say the most parts that are most distinctive about design thinking is it's the degree to which it's user-centric and the human-centric, right? Understand humans, really empathize with them, really get what's happening. That the fact that it goes between very practical and very pragmatic and very real world issues where you're looking at the consequent detail, but also going up to a level of abstraction when you're seeing the big picture, that's different. The use of synthesis in order to do that. What's also very different is breaking down the process so that when you're being creative, you're being very generative, but when you're judging, you're being very brutal, and so you're generating a whole lot of ideas and then throwing all of them out if they're not good. So that generation is very important, and the heavy use of prototyping and testing and working iteratively. That's what's different about design thinking. Now, design thinking scores very high on being human-centered, but there are other tools or other perspectives that are extensions or other perspectives that are coming in that are not exactly design thinking, and I think that there's another form of leadership that's emerging. In fact, I'm in conversation with a lot of people around the world, including the World Economic Forum, around this issue, and that's called systems leadership. And the reason why we are talking about this is that there are a few other elements that are coming in that we need to pay attention to. One of them is scale. Once you take very large scales, the way you need to think and be scale-minded is different. And particularly with the demonstration that there are certain business models or technologies that can be non-linear, then you need to understand the non-linearity of scaling. The other thing is that you need to we need to recognize that we are in a complex world. It always has been, and we got lucky by being narrow in our focus, and now that luck is wearing thin, and unless we understand the complexity of the situation, including the big changes that are happening, including sociological changes, business changes, entire changes in value chains, etc., and the opportunities that are being created by technology, but the changes that are happening in technology are not in the technological regime, but in the changes that they're making in society. And understanding that, having the tools to to decode that, to de-spaghettify that, if I may say, but also innovate within that and create a mindset that is more systems oriented. These are new forms of leadership, but also new approaches that are very pertinent to industry right now, but I would say particularly to the fintech industry because it touches everything.
Yeah.
It's not your, like one can say that, you know, the energy industry touches everything as well. But the energy industry touches things in ways where there is a huge human-centered aspect to it, but not as much as fintech. Fintech, just by the nature of the scales of the scale regimes, where entire nations are operating with financial systems and an individual in a moment in the day, and everything is actually connected, and things that don't even involve money actually look as if they involve money, actually involve money, and financial transactions under the scene, it makes it enormously complex. So I would push for attention on systems leadership as well.
Yeah, that's good. We'll get back to that. I think actually that this we have a question from Padmanathan from VM, and I think it actually goes a little bit to what we're talking about here, but backtracking a little bit. How do you see futures thinking concept, not just looking at people, business and technology, but the social, economic, political environment as factors in the design thinking concepts?
Absolutely. So one of the very important ways in which these two methods I'm talking about is different, is that it's not just assessing the current in clever ways, but it's also imagining a future, a future that is different from the one that is current. So imagine a future, and then a desirable future, and drawing a path to that desirable future, and then putting your next steps, not just in terms of what you have today, but whether or not it's on the path towards the desired future. So the first part is to actually envision the future. But secondly, because we are facing a lot of impending changes, and those changes are very complex and they're very large, so there's sociological changes, political changes, economic changes, geopolitical issues, the fact that we are going to add a few more billion people to a tiny planet that is already 1.4 times its carrying capacity. These are issues that used to be far away and did not affect business, but now they're very central to how you do business, and particularly because a whole lot of the value of your company also has to do with your brand, and brand is no longer to be controlled by your marketing, but by your value systems and the sensibilities of your customers, and just the world out there is changing towards being more whether you're contributing to a more resilient future, both in terms of survival and in terms of contributing towards more desirable futures, but also let's not forget that these challenges are also opportunities in disguise to essentially create new markets rather than just capturing existing ones. The ability to forage into the future becomes very important. So these tools are actually structured to essentially use your imagination to envision futures and then figure out what, if it's desirable, what are the technologies, what are the business models, what are the services, what are the offerings that will actually get you to that future.
That's actually a wonderful way good way of getting back to the discussion around processes. I mean, what does it mean to have a process in design thinking, and what would that mean for the financial sector?
So the moment you say process, you know, there's a certain set of people who think of the government with a lot of forms and so on, and like, you know, and a lot of tables that you check off and so on. I don't mean process in that way. I mean process where it is not entirely intuitive, that you can get a group of people who phase lock on what to do at what time, at what point, right? And they understand they have a metacognition of why they're doing what they're doing and the theory behind it. And not only are they process minded, and they're following a process, they know when to use it and when not to use it, and they can innovate on the process itself, right? And so that is essentially process mindedness. And I think that it's ironic that designers are not known for being process minded, and yet design thinking and systems thinking, because you can go off into the weeds so easily, you actually need to hold on to the core theory of the process and check yourself very often. And in my mind, a good process is a proxy for good leadership. Everything that you'd get with a spectacularly good leader is actually engendered, allowed, if you have good processes in place. Of course, you need the leadership to put the process in place, but essentially what happens is, if you think of leadership not as a person but as a modality, there's a certain way in which people will act if they're being leaders, and they will fail to do that if they're not being leaders on the same day, right? Process allows people to be in their leadership modalities, to be in their to bring themselves into the field as innovators, as game changers, as people who will extract and create disproportionate value out of limited resources. And they will outperform what their current methods are going to give them. And that person could be 20 years old or 70 years old. It's irrespective of rank and experience.
Sure. And they all relates, or it all relates to culture. Culture being key for the innovator and for developing a sort of an innovation environment. How does that play? How does that play into leadership, and how does that play into the overall process and roles?
I think everybody has heard this, saying that culture eats process for breakfast, right? And it's entirely true. The processes can survive only if you create the cultural ecosystem, the cultural frame in which to absorb it. And it turns out that changing the culture is one of the hardest things. It's not easy. You can't just put in a few, like superficial changes and expect the culture to change. You actually, culture change first of all, yes, it is about culture. It's more about culture than people recognize, because once you have the right culture, and I mean culture in the very strict sense of the word. I work with behavioral scientists, and they use culture in a very layered way. I mean in every sense of that layer, right? And institutions develop cultures. They develop deep-rooted philosophical stances, the way they look at the world, what we in academia call ontology and epistemology, where the structure of thinking, but all the way from how little things happen and how you create the new norms. And you need mechanisms to change the current norms to the new norms. And by now, the innovation community has found out a lot about how you change cultures as well. We have tools for that.
And how does that play into one of the sort of very key elements in Silicon Valley and for innovation, risk and failure? Is that part of that?
These are fundamental to the change in culture. I'm very glad you brought this up. So we all care about risk, right? And there are two aspects to risk: the probability of something happening and the salience of what is happening, right? So we all buy car insurance or what have you. We don't believe that this morning we are going to go crash someone, but the salience or the valency of that importance of what that one event that might be unlikely is enough that we actually spend money to buy insurance, right? So because we care about risk, and so much of our business thinking is actually designed to avoid risks, we actually create all these processes that in order to eradicate risk. But because of the way those processes are, we don't raise the floor, the threshold for risk. We also bring down a ceiling, and because we think that out of the box ideas are risky. And in a sense, by being risk averse, we've become risky, right? Because we are not entertaining ideas that will actually change the frame, and we've kind of fallen into incremental ways of thinking at a time when the world order is demanding frame-changing ideas. And actually, our very existence as organizations relies on us being innovative. So we need to understand that we need to be a lot less risk averse, and the better way to actually avoid risk is to understand the value of failure, because typically we culturally we hate failure. If you fail, you kind of shove it under the rug, and you don't talk about it, and you feel as if you've lost, right? And in the innovators world, there are a few forms of failure you really want to avoid, but the rest of the failure modes are your friends, because you essentially the notion that you can get from here to success without going through failure is a laughable one, and you actually need to understand the failure modes in order to design for them. So you actually need to actively seek out failure modes that will happen, because you if you don't look out for them, they will actually catch you, right? And because you don't know what you don't know, you actually need to de-risk in completely different ways. So it's not as if the innovation community and design thinking is taking more risks. In fact, if you look at the history of where they came out from, that community is allowed far less risks. Like some company who, if you look at a design consultancy, some company who spent millions of dollars on and 10 years trying to develop something and failed, then comes and hires an expensive design consultancy and says, you have 3 months to succeed, right? And you'll never get a contract again if you don't succeed. So the constraints are very different for when you use these kind of processes, and you use them when you cannot fail, and when you have very little time, and when you have very little resources, and you have to do breakthrough things, right? So it's just that in the design thinking and innovation communities, you look at risk differently. You're much more risk averse, and you come up with things that might look risky to a novice, but then you de-risk in different ways. So you de-risk by understanding human factor, you frame intelligently, and you prototype, and you try many things cheaply, like inexpensively, in order to understand the failure modes. So this is a very different mindset around risk and failure. If you're not taking enough risk, you're taking a lot of risk.
Yeah. Do you see that working differently from for startups and larger corporations? We have both on the line here. We have representatives for both startup companies that are disrupting the market, and some of the larger players here.
So the startup is actually already in a very risky business. How many startups actually succeed, right? So you get to hear of the ones that succeed, but the number of startups that succeed is actually very, very small. So they're in a very risky business anyways. So to wish away risk is just wishful thinking. But what you need to understand is how to intelligently de-risk without losing out on your ability to really disrupt. And that, if you say that we are doing incremental innovation and disruptive innovation, and you're being risk averse and being sophisticated about understanding risk, and you want to be in that quadrant where you're being disruptive and sophisticated about risk, and not just putting the risk blinders on. Like in my mind, a lot of the normative processes are a little bit like an ostrich. You're essentially looking at a very provincial scale of risk, and you're essentially not looking at the other risk that can come and essentially just capsize you.
And for the larger corporations, is design thinking a means of becoming agile or developing agility? So
I spoke about the startup, and it's already very risky, and you need to understand how to work more in more sophisticated fashion in that element, and also disrupt. But I would say that for the larger organization, moving the needle on how you understand the value of failure and make that into a part of the culture, and raise the like kind of raise the like turn the knob on innovation, and one aspect of that innovation being much more sophisticated about being risk averse without being more risky, right? You actually are taking on risks, but you are finding very different ways of de-risking. This is something that has become very, very important, and it's these innovation methodologies and wrapping cultures and business processes and success criteria, and even I would say HR processes to attract people and reward people for this kind of behavior has become very, very important.
How can you use prototyping and this design thinking process to understand better the problems that you're working in, and how can you employ prototyping and this process in your work?
I would say that we now believe that practically everything can be prototyped, and when it's too big to prototype, you prototype those parts of it that you break parts of it down. And I am an innovator. I come from that community. I think it's madness not to prototype. Like I don't even have the nerve to not prototype my kitchen remodel. I will prototype everything because I have seen so many times tremendous amounts of money being locked into solutions that look very glossy, look very impressive, and they just fail, right? And meanwhile, with a fraction of that cost, with very crude methods, if you had only bothered to prototype in a day's time, I'm not talking months, right, that you would have identified all those failure modes. So when I say prototype, I don't mean expensive prototypes that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and so on. My students, when I give them projects, or when I do consultancy work and when I work with teams, they don't make 2 prototypes. They make dozens of prototypes, right? And so, in any of the projects I've worked on, you can prototype very inexpensively, very cheaply. But to the point of the gentleman who asked that question, I think that prototypes are a way of understanding the problem. And why are we saying that? Because the way we have flipped the process, you don't identify what the problem is and just create an architecture of the solution and then you solve it. You're actually looking at the problem domain and the solution domain simultaneously. And you're moving back and forth. Problem domain, understand better. In order to do that, solve it better. But that told you about problems that you didn't know about, that you didn't know existed. Then you go back into the problem areas with new questions. And what you're doing is you're going back and forth between the problem side and the solution side. And what's changing is the fidelity of your understanding and the fidelity of your solution lockstep, right? So in a sense, your act of trying to solve something is simultaneously populating a space with a potential solution, but it's also a question to ask how the forces out there in the world are going to react to it, which you could not know without proposing something in forms of a solution, because your theory is relatively worthless without having tried something out.
You talked about user centricity. We talked about the processes and the frameworks for developing through tests. We have a question here from Venki Namilakanda from Pluto Robotics. If there's a framework or a process for the BFSI sector which caters to developing habit-forming products with a good gamification to engage people and a good potential for mass adaptation, I think relates to this.
So habit formation, gamification, etc., what is it referring to? It is actually referring to a certain new knowledge set that we have, that we actually had over the years, but we didn't look at it in this way. What we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is a huge emergence of new fields such as behavioral economics, and also many of the behavioral sciences such as social cognitive theory, cognitive psychology, neurocognitive psychology, etc., are not just studying how the human mind works, but they're actually proposing ways in which to modify them. And gamification is actually one form where you're essentially understanding human behavior and the fact that human behavior is not rational, right? And essentially building in your knowledge of the biases, and so we understand, for example, how habits are formed. And so we understand a fair amount about what are the ways in which not only our own habits form, but what are the kind of sequences of experiences you create so that the person finds themselves in that habit, or breaks themselves out of a habit, or exhibit a completely different behavior, right? So a lot of the viewers are now in Copenhagen, right? I show a picture in my class of two pictures, one of Copenhagen and one of LA, right? And one has hundreds of bicycles and the others have cars. And I just have the pictures and I have them guess which city is this, right? Now that it's a profound change in behavior, right? Profound change. And yet it was something that people who live in Copenhagen don't think twice about, and their mindsets around bicycling is different. But it took a certain very specific set of moves such that you get an entire city full of people behaving in one way versus another city of people behaving in a different way, right? And just telling people that, hey, biking is good for you doesn't make people into a bicyclist. In fact, I was in Edinburgh on a very rainy day once. I was at the TED Global in Edinburgh, and this one guy got into my bus, and it helped the fact that he was 6'5", but he had a bike with him, and I said, "Are you from Denmark?" He said, "How did you know?" Right? So I said, "Well, it was obvious. I don't see too many British people biking here, right?" So behavior and gamification and understanding of behavior is very important. In fact, we teach an entire course at Stanford and called Behaviorally Informed Design, where we take design methodologies that look at behavior as behavioral tools and all the phenomena and the gamification principles, etc., and teach people how to use that in designing for behavior. And actually there's a very, very deep connection between FinTech and the technology aspects and the data aspects and what AI is now able to do, what RPA is able to do, etc., and the fact that more and more of the financial lives of people are going under the surface. You don't think even you're not consciously making those choices, the dominant choices that are causing you for money to change accounts, and there's a huge behavioral aspect to this. And so I would say that I'm going to use this in order to urge people to pay attention to this, because if you can only observe behavior, then it's very interesting and it's an academic topic. The moment you can change behavior, it's a technology, right? So behavior, if you can influence it, is a technology. It's an extension of all the other things that you can do.
You talked a little bit about the sort of the Danish culture and the specificities of the Danish culture. We have a question here, which is very Nordic from a local participant, Eilif Tronsen from Silicon Vikings here, who's naturally taking sort of the Nordic perspective on this. And you've also talked about creating rather than taking a market here, and how design thinking works and in the innovation process in relation to this. This question goes to blockchain. I don't think we really have time to sort of dig into the blockchain technology here, but do you have a few remarks on sort of the cultural aspect, and the Nordics, Denmark and the Nordics, how this could be relevant in sort of going a little bit beyond the national state and developing a market here on that level? So
we've had many conversations about the Danish culture and why I'm interested in Denmark in particular. In my experiences, I have found the natural inclinations of innovation, the natural makings of innovation in the Danish culture in much higher levels of incidence than I've seen elsewhere. And that's partially because you have a culture where you're allowed to not be perfectly happy with what you have. You're ranked as number one in your living conditions, etc. But somehow there's a little modesty about it, and there's also questioning about it. But there's a little bit of the intellectual edge and asking deeper questions as to why, etc. And that combination is a magical combination. So the culture of Denmark has, I would say, it's very, very fertile ground for innovation. The thing I would add, which I think is missing, is because you come from small countries, you don't think in global scale. Your sensibilities are tied in the scale of the countries. So you have a lot of startups that go to 100 people, 300 people, and then you're happy, right? And you don't think about the enormous service you could be doing for the entire globe at a time when it's so badly needed, right? So you don't see yourself in terms of the large, grand challenges that just need to be solved, and they're massive markets. So FinTech, for example, I just got back from Africa yesterday, right? And you have to just see what the potential for FinTech out there is. And I'm Indian by origin, a fair number of people in India. It's a fairly large market, and it's not even an undiscovered market. There's a lot of movement happening there. I actually don't know how many FinTech entrepreneurs and players who are actually thinking of those markets aggressively and saying that, hey, those markets will be ours, right? And so that, I think, is a sensibility, if you add to the culture which is already there, could be a very potent combination.
I think that's a very good remark, and it matches very well what we very often talk to startups from Denmark about, going global and seeing the wider potential in your solutions. We discussed in our talks prior to this very much around innovation not just being a matter of skill, but a matter of mindset. It goes back to the discussion on leadership and culture and how you develop an innovative culture. Could you add a few remarks on this?
Yeah, first of all, it really is about changing mindsets. Because if you have the right mindset, so if you're in the oil and gas industry, if you're Chevron, because safety involves tremendous amounts of potential risk, every meeting starts with a 2-minute discussion about safety, even if it's about a board meeting. People will say, I was driving today and I saw someone backing out of their driveway in an SUV, and there could have been a child behind it. And they're not talking about business, but it is raising the consciousness of safety, because safety is important to them, right? I would say that that creates a safety-based mindset, right? So then all those employees are always going to back into a parking space. They are going to see all the problems before they've happened, etc. So mindset is super important. And I would say some of the key dimensions of the mindset is, first of all, be in the innovator's frame. Try to change things in a radical way rather than settling for incremental changes. But don't do this in a woolly-headed way. Know that there's a process, that there is a deep understanding that you need, and you can be creative, and you can wrap it into really pragmatic and rock-solid, very robust offerings, which create disproportionate value. And you're always asking, are we creating fantastic value, right? You're not saying, did we create a whole lot of revenue? How do you know that this will work? Well, the way to know it's going to work is to prototype it, not by some graph that somebody has cooked up saying that, okay, the market is growing here and that's why you are going to succeed. The market could grow and you could fail, right? So in a sense, that the mindset of innovation being very deeply customer-centric, and I would add system-minded, co-creation, being facilitative, being very co-creation in two different ways, co-creating across disciplines and divisions or different perspectives, but also across levels, all the way from people who are bringing in high-level things all the way down to the user and the most humble of users, everything. So both horizontal and vertical co-creation, facilitating the right semantic space and the culture, and essentially playing a very value-based and deeply philosophical stance around changing the world. You actually can do fantastic business. These days, it's become particularly important that you align your value systems to your business. As you do good business, if you choose to move towards a more desirable planet, you will actually find that your business is gaining all the scales of those challenges and what the globe is. And so I think that it is a remarkable time to adopt these new mindsets, and it's also of great importance.
That's a wonderful note to finish this webinar on the wider aspect and taking it beyond the sort of very concrete design thinking process and relating to the systems. Do you have as your sort of very last comment, if you were a young FinTech startup, where would you take that off? What would your sort of key advice be to the young startup developing in the FinTech sector now?
I would say do something very pragmatic about adopting these innovation methodologies. Learn a little bit about it. It's become very accessible, so the threshold is very low. This is not rocket science. If you were ever, a child, you know how to do this. It's actually waking up certain neural nets, but there is process involved. And I would say it's a commitment to do it oneself, get your hands dirty, and your immediate team, whether it's your board members or your team of people who are hacking, whichever team it is, essentially do something that will bring design thinking into your lives, not next month, but this week, right? Do something small and get a taste of it, and you will see the benefits, and you will not need to have webinars trying to convince you. You'll learn. You'll be convinced.
Thank you. We've been through quite a lot here, and we've actually taken it to the limit time-wise. So I think we have to close. Thank you very much for taking the time and coming by, Banny.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
It's really much appreciated. I think we've covered anything from the very concrete elements of implementing and working with design thinking. We've taken it wider to sort of wider systems and how it relates into a much more global context. I think you've been very concrete and very relevant. Thank you.
And have a good one, everybody. Cheers.